One of the most famous autobiographies ever written by an American, and one of the best, is entitled The Education of Henry Adams. It was written by a Harvard professor who was also a very famous historian. And one of the things that makes this autobiography so interesting is that Henry Adams, in this book, tried to determine which parts of his education had been useful and which parts had not been very useful. Which brings me to the theme of today's program, which is, what have the famous thinkers said about education? What have they said are the most important things we can learn in life? If one checks the dictionary for the definition of education, one of the more prominent definitions that is given is that education is a process of obtaining knowledge and skills. But the dictionaries don't tell us which knowledge, which skills are the most important that we can acquire. What I'd like to do here at the outset is to give you a sampling of some ideas from famous thinkers on the subject of education. And then my intention is to delve more deeply into the topic. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very famous 18th century French intellectual, in his autobiography called The Confessions of Jacques Rousseau, said this about education. He said, "This is the first real advantage I derived from my studies. They taught me to reflect and compare values." A.S. Neal was a very famous and controversial 20th century educator. He had his own school in England called Summerhill. And A.S. Neal, in talking about education, emphasized mental health. He said this: "I would rather see a school produce a happy street cleaner than a neurotic scholar." John Dewey, one of America's most famous philosophers and educators, emphasized education as a lifelong process. And he said this: "Real education comes after one leaves school." St. Francis of Assisi emphasized using knowledge. And St. Francis of Assisi said this: "A man has only so much knowledge as he puts to work." And finally, Mark Twain, in a humorous vein, he distinguished between schooling and education and said this: "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." Well, what are the most important things we can learn? Let's start with the obvious, and I don't intend to spend much time on the obvious because it is obvious. I think it's fair to say that all of us need to learn how to read well, compute, write, and also we need to develop self-discipline. Eric Hoffer, known as the longshoreman philosopher because he did work as a longshoreman for many years, summarizes this aspect of education very well. Eric Hoffer said this: "The central task of education is to implant a will and facility for learning." A will, desire, and facility, skills for learning. Also, of course, it's of paramount importance that formal education at least help people to cultivate job skills. After all, everyone needs to make a living. An important question is this: is job advancement the same thing as self-development? Again, is job advancement the same thing as self-development? Sociologist C. Wright Mills said no. And let me quote him. He said, "Job advancement should not be confused with self-development." He suggested that moving up the career ladder is not the same thing as self-development. Many psychologists, psychiatrists, men of letters, women of letters have pointed to some successful careerists who have been very dissatisfied with their lives. The idea being one can have a status job, well-paying job, but yet be very dissatisfied with one's life. The idea is that self-development implies a richer, more soul-satisfying life. Psychiatrist Carl Jung addressed himself to this issue. Jung claimed that so many of his patients were middle-aged men who were very successful careerists, but yet had become very depressed or were suffering from some other neurosis. And Jung said that he came to the conclusion that the reason so many of these very successful careerists were suffering emotional and mental problems was that they had not been true to themselves. He said they had conformed too much and had not engaged in the process of individuation, of cultivating what was idiosyncratic in them. Let me give you Jung's own words about these successful careerists who ran into serious emotional problems. And I must warn you that Jung's language is very hard-hitting. Again, this is psychiatrist Carl Jung. Identification with one's office or one's title is very attractive indeed, which is precisely why so many men are nothing more than the decorum accorded to them by society. In vain, one would look for a personality behind the husk. Underneath all the padding, one would find a very... That is why the office, or whatever this outer husk may be, is so attractive. It offers easy compensation for personal deficiencies. Again, if I can go back to one particular sentence, which was particularly hard-hitting, he talks about some of these successful careerists being nothing more than the decorum accorded to them by society, and he says that underneath all the padding, one would find a very pitiable little creature. So Jung, like so many other famous thinkers, concluded that job and advancement and self-development don't necessarily go together. Which raises the question, besides job skills, what do we need to know to make life satisfying? And here I think Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, in his very famous book, a book I highly recommend, entitled Toward a Meaningful Life, provides some help. That Rabbi Schneerson says that education is not just learning the skills to earn a living, but also is learning to understand life itself. The German philosopher Schopenhauer pointed out that all of us have illusions, all of us have mistaken ideas about life, and that we suffer from them. Let me give you Schopenhauer's own words. He said this: there arise defective concepts and a wrong-headed view of the world, of which almost everyone carries his own version in his head, some for a long time, some forever. Schopenhauer goes on to point out that we all have blind spots, in the sense that there are certain aspects of reality that we are confused about, that we think we know the truth about certain aspects of reality, but we don't, and that we suffer from our false ideas. Which brings me to the question of, or the issue I should say, of what is one of the most important things we can learn. And I think that one of the most important things we can learn in life, perhaps the most important, is to determine what is true about life and people and what is false. If one checks the dictionary for the definition of philosophy, one will find that philosophy is a search for an understanding of reality and values. And what's the definition of a philosopher? A philosopher is a lover of wisdom. What does that mean? Well, wisdom is an understanding of what is true. If we say that a person is wise, that means that that person has a pretty good understanding of what is true about life and people and what is false about what is true, and what is false about life and people. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous American essayist, and lecturer, provides some illumination here. He said that one of our tasks in life is to transform life experiences into truth. Let me give you his own words. We must be habitually engaged in the process of life into truth. And how do we do this? We do it, among other ways, by evaluating our experiences. By evaluating our experiences. How often what we thought true about life and people at age 20, we discovered in middle age to have been false. And in the meantime, we may have suffered very much from our illusions. What I'd like to do now is to talk about certain specific topics, subjects concerning life and people, and what might be true and false concerning them. Let me start with the subject of feeling good about oneself. I think it's fair to say that we all desire to feel good about ourselves. Well, what's true and false about the best way to do this? Well, one viewpoint is this, that the best way to feel good about to successfully impress other people. It could be with one's job, title, it could be with one's house, car, clothes, etc. But the idea is that the path to self-esteem, to liking oneself, is impressing other people. True or false? What do you think? Well, let me give you another viewpoint. Another viewpoint expressed by many philosophers and many religious thinkers is that the best way to go about feeling good about oneself is to be virtuous, to try to be a good person, to try to be a loving person. Montaigne, the French philosopher, put it this way. He said, "A generous pride accompanies a good conscience." A generous pride accompanies a good conscience. Psychiatrist Alfred Adler equated ethics with good mental health. And in fact, he said that his psychology, usually referred to as Adlerian psychology, was really based in many ways on biblical wisdom. And what is biblical wisdom? Well, there is much biblical wisdom, but among the wise things I think the Bible teaches us is that perhaps the best way to go about achieving self-esteem, self-respect, is through being a virtuous human being. Plato, incidentally, believed that the highest form of beauty was goodness and virtue. Emerson, again, provides some illumination on this subject of virtue being the surest path to feeling good about ourselves. Emerson said this, "A more sweet and overpowering beauty appears to man when his heart and mind open to the sentiment of virtue." Another subject I think it's important to address ourselves to and to try to determine what is true and false is this. It concerns the majority. We live in a democratic country, and therefore we attach a lot of importance to what the majority says. And I myself believe that a democratic government is the best kind of government. Although I share Winston Churchill's view. When Winston Churchill was asked his view of democracy, he said, well, when you first examine it, it doesn't look so good. It's so messy that it takes so long for democratic governments to accomplish anything. But then he said this. He said, but then when you compare democracy to the alternatives, when you compare democracy to the alternatives, it looks really good. But I want to talk about the majority in a different context. I think it's fair to say that some people believe that the majority is almost always right, not just about politics, but about other things, and that one should live the way a majority of people thinks one should live. In other words, if I'm following this particular philosophy of life, I should base my way of living on the way the majority thinks a person should live. True or false? Let me give you another viewpoint. Another viewpoint is that we have to be skeptical of the majority. And the reason we have to be skeptical of the majority is that it's only a small percentage of people who think clearly. And why might that be, that only a small number of people think clearly? Well, if one considers thinking to be a skill, such as playing the violin, or playing baseball, or teaching, or being a very good lawyer or doctor, again, if one looks at thinking as a skill, well, then I think one could conclude that it's probably true that since very few people play baseball very well, and very few people play the violin very well, it is likewise true that very few people think very well, and that therefore, if one is basing one's life on how the majority thinks one should live, one may not live as well as one should live. The Buddha put it this way. He said, "The world is in darkness, and how few have the eyes to see." Jesus also warns against conformity. Emerson, whom I've alluded to a few times before because I like his writings so much and I have found so much wisdom in them, Emerson said this: "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." So what I'm suggesting is another version of the path to the good life is to be skeptical of the majority. And history, I think, bears this out, that so often in history, the majority has acted in a wrong-headed manner. Think about the idea that in the southern part of the United States at one time, the majority of people condoned slavery. And think about the idea that throughout history, and even today, a majority of men in many, many cultures have condoned treating women as subservient creatures. We know that in certain cultures in the world today, it seems that the majority of men agree that there's nothing wrong with treating women in a subservient manner. Our Bill of Rights, the United States Bill of Rights, such an important part of our Constitution, I think gives testimony to what I'm saying, because one of the purposes of the Bill of Rights is to protect people from the majority. One of the purposes of the Bill of Rights is to protect the minority from the majority. In other words, the Bill of Rights guarantees Americans, minority groups, not just racial and ethnic minority groups, but all kinds of minority groups, certain rights. Another subject concerning our discussion about what might be true and false is loneliness and the best way to deal with it. Psychologists tell us that loneliness is a part of human life, that all people suffer loneliness at one time or another. In fact, some studies indicate that many people suffer some severe loneliness every week. In any event, what might be the best way to deal with loneliness? One viewpoint is this: the best way to feel less lonely is to be with people. True or false? Well, there is another viewpoint, espoused by David Reisman, very famous writer, who wrote a classic book called The Lonely Crowd. Pretty interesting title and revealing title, The Lonely Crowd. Thoreau comments about this idea of the best way to feel less lonely is to be with other people, and Thoreau criticizes that idea. He said this: "We are, for the most part, more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our own chambers." What do you think about that? Is it possible we can be more lonely with other people than when alone? I suspect that sometimes that is true. Well, again, the question is, what might be the best way to deal with loneliness? Well, as I indicated in a previous program, among the best ways so many of the great thinkers have said we can reduce our loneliness is first, to learn to enjoy one's own company, and secondly, to engage in meaningful activity. The idea being that when we are engaged in meaningful activity, could be reading, it could be carpentry, it could be working well with one's hands in some other way, one can get into a state of flow where one even forgets about oneself and the fact that one is alone, because your mind is preoccupied with the book or baking a cake or building something. What might be the best path to happiness? What might be true and false concerning the best path to happiness? Well, one viewpoint says that the best path to happiness would be one that emphasizes passively amusing ourselves with television and computers, and also doing lots of shopping. But amusing ourselves and shopping, that's the way to go if we want more happiness in life. Another viewpoint, expressed by many thinkers, including Plato, Aristotle, Freud, and others, is that the best way, the truest way to pursue happiness or increased happiness in our lives is the way that emphasizes learning and loving. That if we wish to be happier people, we must learn to understand better our own nature and the nature of life. And that also, the path to happiness, besides involving learning and understanding more about ourselves and life, also involves being a just, loving person. And the idea is that if we wish to be happier people, learning and loving and being virtuous, or trying to be virtuous, is a truer path than engaging in endless amusing of ourselves and a lot of shopping. What do you think? One other important subject concerning, again, what might be true and false, concerns loving relationships. Some people believe that having a loving relationship with another person comes naturally to people, that there is nothing to learn, no skills involved. Anybody can do it. Is that true or false? Can anyone achieve a successful, loving relationship? Well, there is another viewpoint, and that is expressed by psychoanalyst Erich Fromm and many other thinkers. Erich Fromm, in his classic book entitled The Art of Loving, says that love is an art in the same way that learning to paint or to teach or to be a lawyer or a doctor is an art. And since loving is an art, it requires certain knowledge, certain skills, and certain character traits. And that if we don't develop the appropriate knowledge and skills and character traits, we're not going to be able to be very good at loving. That loving is a skill which one cultivates. With regard to the subject of death and thinking about death, what might be true and false? We all know that we're going to die. Some people believe that thinking about death will make us very sad and nervous, and therefore it's in our selfish interest to try to avoid thinking about death if we wish to get more satisfaction from life. Do you think that's true? Is it in our selfish interest to avoid thinking about death? There is another viewpoint represented by many religious thinkers, and Jung and Freud, and by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who years ago wrote a very illuminating book entitled On Death and Dying. These people claim that we should make it a habit to think about death. They claim that it can help give us perspective, that it provides a frame around life, and that we can see our problems more clearly, that we can remember, for example, that whether we worry or don't worry, we are still going to die. And also that thinking about death on a regular basis reminds us that our time to live and love is limited. And of course, for religious believers, for people who believe in a hereafter, the idea of thinking about death, and perhaps even making it a habit to think about death, can remind one to try to keep one's soul clean. In this context, Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, said this. He said, "As a doctor, I am convinced that it is hygienic to discover a goal towards which one can strive, and that shrinking away from it is something unhealthy and abnormal, which robs the second half of life of its purpose. That Jung is saying, that in his opinion, it is true that it is hygienic. In summing up some of the points that I made in this program and attempting to focus on what many famous thinkers have said are the most important things we have learned in life, I'd like to point out something Santayana said. Santayana was an American professor of philosophy. He taught at Columbia University for many years. Santayana said that wisdom comes by disillusionment. Wisdom comes by disillusionment. What does that mean? Well, it means that we achieve wisdom by freeing ourselves from false ideas. You recall early on, I pointed out that Schopenhauer said we all have mistaken ideas about people, including ourselves, and life. And as we grow older, if we acquire some wisdom, we can find out more accurately what is true and what is false about people and life. And in so doing, again, acquire more wisdom. Jesus talked about the importance of truth. In John 8, Jesus says, "The truth will make you free." And so many philosophers, even atheists, agree with Jesus that the truth can make one free. It is true that the truth can hurt, but avoiding the truth can be even more painful. Let me close with a thought from one of my favorite philosophers. It is actually my favorite quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau said, "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."